The sound of grinding metal echoed through the cramped garage as Marcus Rivera wiped grease from his weathered hands, squinting through the dim fluorescent light at the wheelchair that had just rolled through his shop door. Behind the wheels sat a 17-year-old kid with eyes that held more determination than most adults Marcus had ever met, and beside him stood a woman whose face carried the weight of medical bills and shattered dreams. What happened next would change all three of their lives forever and catch the attention of racing teams from around the world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Rivera had been fixing cars for 23 years in the industrial district of Phoenix, Arizona, where the desert heat made every day feel like working inside an oven. His garage, Rivera's Auto Repair, was wedged between a tire shop and a defunct restaurant that still had Christmas lights hanging from its broken sign. The building itself was nothing to look at, with its peeling paint and oil-stained concrete floor, but Marcus had built a reputation for bringing dead engines back to life when nobody else could. He specialized in the impossible cases, the vehicles other mechanics had given up on. His tools were mostly second-hand, his equipment outdated, but his hands understood metal and machinery in ways that fancy computer diagnostics never could. Customers drove from 3 counties away because Marcus Rivera could make a 20-year-old transmission purr like it was fresh off the assembly line. The morning everything changed started like any other. Marcus arrived at 6:30, unlocked the metal roll-up door, and let the Arizona sun stream across the concrete floor. He had 3 jobs waiting: a 1995 Ford pickup with a mysterious rattling noise, a sedan with electrical problems that had stumped 2 other shops, and a motorcycle that had been sitting in the corner for 6 months while its owner scraped together money for parts. He was elbow deep in the Ford's engine compartment when he heard the sound of wheels on concrete. Not car wheels, something different, softer. He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days, and turned toward the open garage door. The wheelchair moved with practiced precision, its occupant navigating around oil stains and scattered tools like he'd been doing it his whole life. The kid couldn't have been more than 17, with sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead and arms that had clearly adapted to doing the work of legs. He wore a faded racing t-shirt with Dale Earnhardt's number 3, and his hands gripped the wheelchair's push rims with calloused fingers that spoke of hours spent propelling himself through a world not built for wheels. Behind him walked a woman in her mid-40s, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had given up trying to look professional. She wore scrubs, the kind that suggested long shifts at a hospital or care facility, and her face carried the particular exhaustion that came from fighting insurance companies and medical bills. But her eyes, the same deep brown as the kid's, held fierce love and stubborn hope. The kid rolled right up to Marcus, extended a hand, and said with a grin that lit up the whole garage, "You Marcus Rivera? I'm Danny Martinez, and I need your help building something that's never been built before." Marcus shook the offered hand, surprised by the firm grip and the direct eye contact. Most people, especially teenagers, seemed uncomfortable in his garage, intimidated by the noise and the smell of motor oil. But Danny Martinez looked around the cramped space like he'd found exactly what he was looking for. "This is my mom, Elena," Danny continued, gesturing toward the woman who stepped forward with a smile that didn't quite hide her worry. "We heard you're the guy who fixes the impossible stuff." Marcus nodded slowly, studying them both. "Depends what kind of impossible we're talking about. What's broken?" Quote. Danny's grin widened. "Nothing's broken. We want to build a racing car." Elena Martinez shifted uncomfortably, her hands fidgeting with the strap of a worn purse that had seen too many trips to medical appointments. "Danny, maybe we should explain the situation first." But Danny was already rolling closer to Marcus, his eyes scanning the tools and equipment scattered around the garage. "See, here's the thing. I've been obsessed with racing my whole life. Formula 1, IndyCar, NASCAR, doesn't matter. I know every driver, every team, every technical regulation from the past 15 years. I can tell you why Lewis Hamilton's car setup works in Monaco but struggles in Monza. I understand aerodynamics and suspension geometry better than most engineering students." Marcus listened, intrigued despite himself. The kid spoke with the kind of passion that couldn't be faked, using technical terms that most adults didn't understand. 3 years ago, Danny continued, his voice growing quieter, I was racing go-karts at a local track. Nothing fancy, just weekend races with other kids. I was actually pretty good at it, won a few regional championships, had some sponsors interested. He paused, his hands tightening on the wheelchair's armrests. Then I took a corner too fast at Phoenix International Raceway during a practice session. Car flipped, landed on its roof. Crushed my spine. The garage fell silent, except for the distant hum of traffic and the tick of cooling metal from the Ford's engine. Marcus set down his wrench, giving Danny his full attention. "Doctor said I'd never walk again," Danny said matter-of-factly. Racing was over. Game finished. Time to find a nice, quiet hobby that wouldn't get me hurt. He looked up at Marcus with eyes that blazed with defiance. But I figured out something they didn't consider. Just because my legs don't work, doesn't mean I can't drive. Elena stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. The insurance settlement from the track covered Danny's medical expenses and rehabilitation, but there was some money left over. Not much, but enough to maybe, possibly, if we're very careful and very lucky, fund a project. Marcus rubbed his chin, leaving a small streak of grease along his jawline. What kind of project are we talking about here? Danny leaned forward in his wheelchair, his whole body radiating excitement. A custom-built racing car designed specifically for hand controls. No pedals, everything operated through the steering wheel and hand levers. Fully competitive, meeting all safety regulations. Capable of racing against able-bodied drivers on equal terms. "Danny," Elena said gently, "tell him about the research." Danny nodded eagerly. "I spent 2 years studying adaptive racing technology. There are a few companies in Europe that build hand control systems for racing cars, but they're incredibly expensive and mostly designed for recreational driving, not serious competition. The few truly competitive adaptive race cars cost upward of $200,000. Marcus let out a low whistle. "That's a lot of zeros." "Which is why we're here," Danny said. "Mom and I have $12,000. I know that's not much in the racing world, but I've seen what you can do with scrap metal and determination. I've been watching your YouTube channel where you rebuild engines that other people threw away. You make miracles happen with duct tape and ingenuity." Marcus blinked. "I have a YouTube channel." Elena smiled for the first time since entering the garage. "Danny started following you 6 months ago. You have about 800 subscribers, mostly people who've brought cars here and filmed you working. Danny's watched every single video at least 3 times. Danny pulled out his phone, scrolled through a playlist, and showed Marcus the screen. Sure enough, there were dozens of videos titled things like "Marcus brings dead V8 back to life" and "Impossible transmission rebuild in desert garage." The view counts weren't huge, but the comments were filled with admiration and technical questions. "You're famous and you don't even know it," Danny said with a "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." Laugh. "But that's not why we're here. We're here because you understand that every piece of machinery has potential, even when everyone else has given up on it." Marcus studied Danny's face, seeing something he recognized from his own reflection during the hardest years of his life. The kid had the look of someone who'd been counted out, written off, told to accept limitations. It was a look Marcus knew intimately. 25 years ago, Marcus had been a promising mechanical engineering student at Arizona State University. He'd had dreams of working for NASCAR teams, designing race car engines, maybe even starting his own performance shop. Then his father had suffered a massive heart attack, leaving behind a pile of medical debt and a small auto repair business that was hemorrhaging money. Marcus had dropped out of college to save the family shop, trading his dreams of racing glory for the daily reality of oil changes and brake repairs. He'd told himself it was temporary, that he'd go back to school once things stabilized. But years turned into decades, dreams faded into memories, and Marcus Rivera became just another small-town mechanic fixing other people's transportation instead of building machines that could fly. Looking at Danny Martinez, Marcus saw the fire he'd once carried, the refusal to accept that circumstances had to define possibilities. The kid was asking him to build something extraordinary with ordinary resources, to prove that innovation mattered more than money. $12,000, Marcus said slowly, to build a competitive racing car. "I know it sounds impossible," Elena said, her voice carrying years of being told what her son couldn't do. But Danny has it all planned out. He spent months researching parts, suppliers, design specifications. He's even been in contact with racing sanctioning bodies about adaptive vehicle regulations. Danny nodded enthusiastically. The biggest expense is usually the chassis. But I found a damaged Formula Ford chassis being sold by a racing school in California. It was in a minor accident, mostly cosmetic damage, but they can't use it for student drivers anymore due to liability concerns. They'll sell it for $3,000. Marcus raised an eyebrows. Formula Ford? Open-wheel racing series designed for driver development, Danny explained. Think of it as the stepping stone to IndyCar or Formula One. The cars are relatively simple, about 400 pounds lighter than a NASCAR vehicle, with excellent power-to-weight ratios. Perfect platform for adaptation. And the engine? Danny's grin returned. That's where you come in. I found a Honda motorcycle engine, a CBR 1000RR unit with 60,000 miles on it. The owner thinks it's blown because it's making unusual noises, but I listened to the video he posted online. It's not engine damage, just worn valve seals. Totally rebuildable. Marcus found himself leaning forward, drawn into the technical challenge despite himself. How much? $1,500, which leaves us money for hand controls, safety equipment, wheels, tires, and about 1,000 smaller components that racing cars need to actually run. Elena watched her son explain his plan, her expression mixing pride with worry. Marcus could see that she didn't fully understand the technical details, but she understood her son's passion. She'd probably heard this presentation dozens of times, had probably lost sleep, worrying about whether encouraging Danny's dream was helping him or setting him up for heartbreak. Marcus walked over to his workbench and picked up a wrench, turning it over in his hands while he thought. The smart thing would be to politely decline. Building a racing car wasn't like rebuilding a transmission. The liability alone could destroy his small business. Racing was dangerous under the best circumstances, and creating a custom vehicle for a paralyzed teenager added layers of complexity that could go wrong in catastrophic ways. But as he looked at Danny Martinez, sitting in that wheelchair with absolute conviction blazing in his eyes, Marcus remembered being 22 years old and believing he could engineer his way to racing glory. He remembered the weight of deferred dreams, the slow erosion of believing anything extraordinary was possible. "Show me the chassis," Marcus said finally. "Show me the engine. Show me every single component on your list and every regulation we need to meet. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." Danny's whoop of joy echoed through the garage, loud enough to startle a lizard that had been sunning itself on the concrete. Elena Martinez closed her eyes, and Marcus saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer of gratitude or a plea for protection. "When do we start?" Danny asked, already rolling toward the workbench where Marcus kept his computer. "We start by learning everything there is to know about adaptive racing technology," Marcus said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Then we figure out how to build something nobody's ever built before with money nobody thinks is enough." That afternoon, Danny Martinez became a regular fixture in Rivera's auto repair. He arrived every day after school, homework completed in the passenger seat of his mother's Honda Civic during the drive-over. Elena had rearranged her work schedule at the medical clinic where she worked as a billing coordinator, taking evening shifts so she could drive Danny to the garage and pick him up before dark. The first 2 weeks were pure research. Marcus had Danny document everything, creating detailed files on hand control systems, racing regulations, safety requirements, and technical specifications. They watched hours of video footage from adaptive racing programs in Europe and Australia, studying how other teams had solved similar challenges. Danny proved to be a natural researcher, approaching each problem with systematic thoroughness that impressed Marcus. The kid would arrive with printed articles, technical diagrams, and pages of handwritten notes. He'd spent his own money on racing engineering textbooks, studying suspension geometry and aerodynamics with the intensity of a graduate student. "Look at this," Danny said one evening, spreading blueprints across Marcus's workbench. "This is the hand control system used by a British team in the European Formula Renault series. Everything's operated through paddle shifters and thumb controls mounted on the steering wheel. Marcus studied the diagrams, noting the elegant simplicity of the design. Throttle control through a thumb lever on the right side of the steering wheel, braking through a hand lever that operated independently of the steering system. The clutch was eliminated entirely, replaced by a sequential gearbox that could be shifted with paddles behind the steering wheel. "This is brilliant," Marcus admitted, "but those components probably cost more than our entire budget." Danny nodded. "Which is why we're going to build our own version. I've been sketching modifications that should work with readily available motorcycle parts." He pulled out a notebook filled with detailed drawings. "We can adapt the throttle control from a motorcycle twist grip, mount it on the steering wheel so it operates with thumb pressure instead of wrist rotation. And the brakes? Mountain bike brake levers, modified and reinforced to handle the hydraulic pressure of racing brakes. The leverage ratio will be different, but I calculated the mathematics. It should provide adequate stopping power while maintaining fine control." Marcus flipped through Danny's notebook, amazed by the depth of the calculations. The kid had worked out stress analysis, fluid dynamics, and mechanical advantage ratios that would have challenged engineering students. All of it done by hand, with reference books and online resources, driven by pure determination to solve an impossible puzzle. "How long have you been working on this?" Marcus asked. Danny shrugged, suddenly looking younger than his 17 years. "Since about a week after the accident. The first year was pretty dark, you know? Couldn't walk, couldn't race, felt like everything that mattered was over. But then I started thinking about the actual problem. Racing isn't about legs, it's about reflexes, spatial awareness, understanding how machines behave under stress. All the stuff that made me good at karting, that was still there." He pointed to a detailed sketch of the steering wheel assembly. "So I started figuring out how to translate foot controls into hand controls without losing precision or speed. It became like this massive engineering puzzle that kept growing more complex and more interesting." Marcus understood completely. There was something addictive about impossible problems, the way they demanded everything you had and then asked for more. He'd spent sleepless nights working on particularly stubborn engines, driven by the refusal to accept defeat more than by any practical concern. "Your mom okay with all this?" Marcus asked, glancing toward the garage entrance where Elena usually waited in her car, grading papers or reading while Danny worked. Danny's expression grew more serious. "She's scared. I mean, she supports me, but she's terrified something's gonna happen. The accident was pretty traumatic for her too. She was the one who got the call from the hospital, who had to make all the medical decisions when I was unconscious." He paused, his hands stilling on the notebook pages. "She sacrificed a lot for my medical care and therapy. Took out loans, worked extra shifts, never bought anything for herself. Now I'm asking her to gamble the settlement money on a project that might not work. But she's letting you try." "Yeah," Danny said with a small smile. "Because she knows I have to. Not want to, have to. It's like, if I don't at least attempt this, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been possible." Marcus nodded, recognizing the feeling. He'd been carrying his own what-if for 25 years, the ghost of the racing career he'd never pursued. Watching Danny fight for his version of that dream felt like getting a second chance at something he'd thought was lost forever. That night, after Danny and Elena had left, Marcus stayed in the garage until nearly midnight, sketching his own modifications to Danny's designs. He found himself thinking like an engineer again for the first time in decades, considering weight distribution and component integration with the kind of focus he'd forgotten he possessed. Building this car wouldn't just be about helping a paralyzed teenager fulfill an impossible dream. It would be about proving to himself that extraordinary things were still possible, that 25 years of fixing other people's problems hadn't completely extinguished the fire he'd once carried. As he finally locked up the garage and headed home to his small apartment, Marcus Rivera realized he was more excited about going to work than he'd been in years. Tomorrow, they would start building something that had never existed before. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of turning $12,000 and unlimited determination into a machine capable of racing wheel-to-wheel with the best drivers in the world. The desert stars blazed overhead as Marcus drove through the empty streets of Phoenix, already planning the first modifications they would need to make to that damaged Formula Ford chassis sitting in a California racing school, waiting to be transformed into something miraculous. The damaged Formula Ford chassis arrived on a flatbed truck 3 weeks later, looking like the skeleton of something that had once been beautiful. Marcus and Danny stood in the blazing Arizona sun, watching the driver carefully maneuver the twisted aluminum frame off his trailer with a small forklift. What had once been a precisely engineered racing machine now resembled modern art, with bent suspension components and a cockpit that had been compressed by impact. Elena Martinez clutched her purse tighter as she surveyed the wreckage. $3,000 of their precious budget had just been delivered, and it looked like expensive scrap metal. Danny, however, rolled his wheelchair around the chassis with the excitement of an archaeologist discovering buried treasure. "Look at the main structure," he said, running his hands along the central spine of the frame. "The primary safety cell is completely intact. All the damage is to replaceable components, suspension arms, body panels, stuff we can fabricate ourselves." Marcus knelt beside the front suspension, examining the bent control arms and damaged steering components. The kid was right. The chassis itself, the critical foundation that everything else bolted to, showed no signs of structural compromise. They could strip away the damaged parts and rebuild everything else from scratch. "It's going to need a complete teardown," Marcus said, already mentally cataloging the work ahead. "Every bolt, every component, everything comes apart so we can assess what's salvageable and what needs replacement." Danny grinned. "That's the fun part. We get to understand exactly how everything works before we start modifying it." Over the next 2 weeks, the chassis became the centerpiece of Rivera's auto repair. Marcus cleared out half his workspace, moving customer cars to make room for what Danny had started calling, quote, Project Phoenix. Every afternoon after school, Danny would arrive ready to work, equipped with tools his mother had bought him and a notebook where he documented every step of the process. The teardown revealed both good news and challenges. The chassis was indeed structurally sound, requiring only minor straightening of mounting points. The damaged suspension components, while expensive to replace with racing parts, could be rebuilt using modified motorcycle and automotive components that cost a fraction of the original price. "Racing parts are expensive because they're specialized," Marcus explained as they examined a bent control arm that would cost $800 to replace with an identical piece. "But the actual function isn't that different from a heavy-duty truck suspension component. We just need to modify the mounting points and adjust the geometry." Danny proved to be a quick learner with tools, adapting his upper body strength to handle tasks that usually required full mobility. Marcus watched him develop techniques for working around the chassis, using his wheelchair to access different angles and heights, turning his limitations into advantages that allowed him to reach spaces that were difficult for standing mechanics. The first major breakthrough came when they tackled the hand control system. Marcus had found a crashed sport bike in a salvage yard, a machine that had been totaled in an accident but still contained a perfectly functional throttle assembly and hydraulic brake system. Danny had spent hours studying the components, figuring out how to adapt motorcycle controls for racing car use. "The key is maintaining the same response curve," Danny explained as they dismantled the motorcycle's handlebar controls. "A racing driver needs instant, precise throttle response. If there's any delay or dead space in the control, it affects lap times and, more importantly, safety." They fabricated a custom mounting system that positioned a modified motorcycle throttle grip within easy reach of Danny's thumb while his hands remained on the steering wheel. The original twist grip motion was converted to a thumb lever system that provided the same range of motion with even finer control precision. The brake system proved more complex. Racing brakes required enormous pressure to operate effectively, far more than any hand lever was designed to handle. Marcus spent several evenings working through the hydraulic calculations, designing a custom master cylinder system that would amplify the force from Danny's hand controls while maintaining the precise modulation necessary for competitive racing. "Braking is everything in racing," Danny said as they tested different lever configurations on a wooden mock-up of the steering wheel assembly. "You can have the fastest car in the world, but if you can't brake consistently and precisely, you'll never win races." Elena Martinez watched her son work with tools and machinery, seeing a version of Danny she hadn't witnessed since before the accident. For 3 years, she'd watched him struggle with depression, anger, and the brutal process of learning to navigate a world designed for people who could walk. Physical therapy had been a daily battle, occupational therapy, a series of small victories and frustrating setbacks. But in Marcus Rivera's garage, Danny moved with purpose and confidence. His hands, which had learned to push a wheelchair and transfer his body weight, now manipulated precision tools and handled delicate mechanical components. The teenager who had lost the use of his legs was discovering that his mind and his determination were more powerful than any physical limitation. Marcus began staying later each evening, working on the project long after Danny and Elena had gone home. He found himself thinking about racing engineering in ways he hadn't since college, researching advanced suspension geometry and aerodynamic principles that went far beyond anything required for standard automotive repair. The Honda CBR engine arrived a month later, and its condition exceeded even Danny's optimistic expectations. The motorcycle's owner had been convinced the engine was destroyed, but Marcus's experienced ear immediately identified the problem as worn valve guides, a repair that would require precision work, but nothing approaching the complexity of a full rebuild. "This is a beautiful piece of engineering," Marcus said as they stripped the engine down to its individual components. The Honda's inline-4 configuration produced nearly 200 horsepower from just 1 liter of displacement, with a rev limit approaching 12,000 RPM. It was light, compact, and designed for the kind of high RPM operation that racing demanded. Danny studied every component as they disassembled the engine, learning the function of each part and how they work together to create power. Marcus explained the theory behind valve timing, fuel injection mapping, and ignition advance curves, watching Danny absorb technical information with the hunger of someone who understood that knowledge was the foundation of everything they were trying to accomplish. "Racing engines are about precision," Marcus said, showing Danny how to measure valve clearances with feeler gauges. "Street engines are designed for reliability and fuel economy. Racing engines are designed for maximum power output over shorter periods, which means every clearance, every timing specification, every component has to be perfect." They rebuilt the Honda engine over 6 weeks, working methodically through each system. Marcus taught Danny how to read micrometers and dial indicators, how to interpret surface finish specifications, how to balance rotating components for high RPM operation. It was the kind of detailed, precise work that required patience and absolute attention to detail. Elena found herself staying later in the parking lot, watching through the garage door as her son learned skills that no high school curriculum included. She saw him develop confidence with complex tools, saw him solve problems that required both theoretical knowledge and practical innovation. For the first time since the accident, Danny was building something instead of just recovering from something. The engine reassembly became a celebration of precision engineering. Every clearance was measured 3 times, every bolt torqued to exact specifications, every component installed with the kind of care usually reserved for museum pieces. When Marcus finally turned the key on their custom engine test stand, the Honda fired immediately, settling into the smooth idle of a perfectly tuned power plant. Danny's whoop of joy echoed through the garage as the engine revved cleanly through its power band, producing the distinctive sound of a high-performance motorcycle engine running without restriction. They had taken a pile of worn components and transformed them into something capable of propelling a racing car at speeds approaching 150 miles per hour. "Phase 1 complete," Danny said, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Now we figure out how to make everything work together." Integrating the engine into the Formula Ford chassis required custom fabrication work that pushed Marcus's capabilities to their limits. Racing cars were designed with specific weight distribution requirements, suspension geometry calculations, and aerodynamic considerations that couldn't be ignored without compromising performance and safety. They spent weeks designing motor mounts that would position the Honda engine at exactly the right location relative to the car's center of gravity. Too far forward, and the car would understeer, requiring more effort to turn into corners. Too far back, and it would oversteer, becoming unstable and difficult to control at high speeds. "It's all about balance," Danny explained as they used a scale to measure the weight distribution of their modified chassis. "The best racing cars feel neutral, like they're an extension of the driver's body. You think about turning, and the car turns. You think about braking, and it slows down exactly as much as you expect." Marcus found himself impressed not just by Danny's theoretical knowledge, but by his intuitive understanding of vehicle dynamics. The kid could explain complex engineering principles in simple terms, could visualize how changes to one component would affect the behavior of the entire system. The custom transmission proved to be their biggest challenge. Racing cars typically used sequential gearboxes that could be shifted without using a clutch, but those systems cost more than their entire budget. Danny had researched motorcycle transmissions, finding a unit from a high-performance sport bike that could be adapted for their application. "Motorcycle transmissions are designed for exactly what we need," Danny said, showing Marcus the technical specifications for a Kawasaki 6-speed unit. Sequential shifting, dog ring engagement for fast gear changes, and it's already designed to handle high power-to-weight ratios. Adapting the motorcycle transmission required fabricating a custom bell housing to mate the Honda engine to the Kawasaki gearbox, along with a new shift mechanism that Danny could operate using paddle shifters mounted behind the steering wheel. Marcus spent countless hours machining components on his old lathe, creating parts that racing teams usually ordered from specialized suppliers. Elena Martinez watched the bills accumulate, their careful budgets stretched by unexpected expenses and the cost of materials they hadn't anticipated needing. 3 months into the project, they had spent nearly $8,000 of their $12,000, and the car was still weeks away from running under its own power. "Maybe we should take a break," she suggested one evening as Danny cleaned grease from his hands before the drive home. "Let the finances recover, save up some more money before we continue." Danny shook his head firmly. "We're too close to stop now. The hard stuff is mostly finished. Engine runs perfectly. Transmission is adapted. Chassis is ready for final assembly. We just need wheels, tires, safety equipment, and a few smaller components." Marcus supported Danny's assessment. They had solved the major engineering challenges, overcome the technical obstacles that could have made the project impossible. The remaining work was mostly assembly and testing, expensive but straightforward compared to the custom fabrication they had already completed. "I can contribute some labor costs," Marcus offered, surprising himself with the words. "This project has become as important to me as it is to Danny. I want to see it finished." Elena looked between the middle-aged mechanic and her determined son, seeing something that went beyond a business relationship. Marcus had become invested in Danny's success in ways that transcended money. He stayed late working on components that Danny couldn't handle alone, researched technical solutions during his own time, and contributed expertise that no amount of money could have purchased. "You don't have to do that," she said quietly. "You've already done so much." Marcus wiped his hands on a shop rag, considering his words carefully. 25 years ago, I had plans to work in racing. Engineering degree. Internship lined up with a NASCAR team. Dreams of building cars that could win championships. Life had other ideas, and I ended up here instead. He gestured around the small garage, with its outdated equipment and oil-stained concrete floor. "This is a good life, don't get me wrong. I help people, I solve problems, I make enough money to pay my bills. But it's not the life I planned." Danny listened intently, understanding that Marcus was sharing something important. "Working on this project has reminded me what it felt like to believe in something extraordinary," Marcus continued. "Danny's right about being close. We've built something that nobody thought was possible. With the resources we have, I want to see it cross the finish line." That evening, Danny called a friend from his karting days, a kid named Travis who had continued racing after Danny's accident. Travis had moved up to Formula Ford competition, running regional races with his father's well-funded team. "You should come see what we're building," Danny said over the phone. "I think it might surprise you." Travis arrived the following Saturday with his father, both of them skeptical about what they expected to find in a small auto repair shop. They were accustomed to professional racing facilities, shops filled with expensive equipment, and teams of specialized technicians. What they found instead was something that challenged their assumptions about what racing required. The Formula Ford chassis sat in the center of the garage, transformed from the twisted wreckage they had purchased into something that looked genuinely purposeful. The Honda engine was installed and running, its modified exhaust system producing the distinctive sound of a high-performance power plant. The custom hand controls were mounted and functional, the steering wheel bristling with switches, levers, and paddle shifters that Danny operated with fluid precision. "This is unbelievable," Travis said, circling the car with growing amazement. "You built this entire system from scratch?" Danny demonstrated the hand controls, showing how throttle, braking, and shifting could all be operated without using feet. The system responded instantly to his inputs, translating hand movements into vehicle control with the precision that racing demanded. Travis's father, a successful businessman who had funded his son's racing career with expensive equipment and professional coaching, examined the custom fabrication work with evident respect. "Who did the engineering on this control system?" "Danny designed it," Marcus said with obvious pride. "I helped with the fabrication, but the concept, the calculations, the problem-solving, that was all him." "And you built this entire car for what, $15,000? 12,000, Elena corrected. Maybe a little more by the time we finish, but not much. Travis's father shook his head in amazement. Racing was typically a sport that demanded enormous financial resources, with competitive cars costing hundreds of thousands of dollars and requiring teams of professional mechanics and engineers. What he was looking at represented a completely different approach to the same goal. "Have you thought about what happens after you finish the build?" Travis asked Danny. "Where are you going to race it?" Danny's expression grew more serious. "That's the next challenge. Most racing series have never dealt with adaptive vehicles. We're going to have to convince officials that the car meets safety standards and that hand controls don't provide an unfair advantage or disadvantage." Travis nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. Racing was governed by detailed technical regulations designed to ensure fair competition and safety. Danny's car would require approval from sanctioning bodies that had never encountered anything like it. "My dad knows people in time. Formula Ford administration," Travis offered. "Maybe we can arrange for some kind of evaluation, get you approved for competition." It was the first time anyone had spoken about the project in terms of actual racing rather than just completing the build. Danny had been so focused on solving the technical challenges that he hadn't allowed himself to think seriously about what would happen if they succeeded. Marcus watched the interaction, seeing Danny begin to consider possibilities beyond the garage. The kid had approached the project with the single-minded determination to prove that adaptive racing was possible, but he hadn't planned for what success might look like. That night, after Travis and his father had left, Marcus found Danny sitting quietly beside the car, just looking at what they had created together. "Scared?" Marcus asked. Danny considered the question honestly. "Terrified. For 3 years this has been a dream, something to work toward. If we actually finish it, if it actually works, then I have to find out whether I'm still the driver I used to be." Marcus understood the fear completely. Dreams were safe as long as they remained dreams. Actually pursuing them meant risking failure, discovering limitations, confronting the possibility that wanting something wasn't enough to make it happen. "You know what I think?" Marcus said, leaning against the workbench. "I think you're not the same driver you used to be. I think you're better." Danny looked up, surprised by the statement. The kid who crashed that go-kart was talented, but he was also reckless. He took unnecessary risks because he didn't understand what he had to lose. Marcus continued. "The person who designed this control system, who calculated every component specification, who spent 6 months researching solutions to problems nobody else had solved, that person understands racing in ways that 17-year-old go-kart driver never did." Marcus gestured toward the car, its modified chassis gleaming under the garage lights. "This isn't just about proving you can still drive. It's about proving that different doesn't mean inferior. Every racing team in the world is going to look at this car and realize they've been thinking about driver limitations all wrong." Danny nodded slowly, beginning to understand that their project had implications beyond his personal comeback story. They were creating something that could change how the racing world thought about accessibility, about the relationship between physical capability and driving skill. "So we finish it," Danny said, his voice growing stronger, "and then we find out what it can do." The final month of the build proceeded with increasing momentum. Word had begun to spread through the local racing community about the adaptive Formula Ford being constructed in Rivera's auto repair. Other mechanics stopped by to see the custom fabrication work. Drivers came to examine the hand control system, and even a reporter from a local newspaper visited to write a story about the unusual project. Marcus found himself enjoying the attention in ways he hadn't expected. For 25 years, his work had been largely invisible, fixing problems that people noticed only when they broke. Now he was creating something that people came specifically to see, something that challenged assumptions and demonstrated possibilities. Danny had grown more confident with each completed component, his initial nervousness about the project's feasibility replaced by quiet certainty that they were building something special. He moved through the garage with the familiarity of someone who belonged there, his wheelchair navigating between tools and equipment like he'd been working in the space for years rather than months. Elena Martinez watched her son transform from someone recovering from tragedy into someone actively pursuing dreams. The change went beyond the technical skills he was learning or the engineering knowledge he was acquiring. Danny was becoming the person he had been before the accident, but with added depth and determination that came from understanding what it meant to fight for something important. The day they installed the final components, wheels and tires that had been donated by a local racing tire distributor who had heard about the project, the garage filled with an electricity that none of them had anticipated. The Formula Ford sat complete, its Honda engine idling smoothly, its custom controls ready for operation. Danny positioned himself in the driver's seat, his hands finding the controls with the natural precision of someone who had designed every aspect of their placement. Marcus made final adjustments to the throttle linkage while Elena stood nearby, her expression mixing pride with the eternal worry that came with watching her son pursue activities that involved speed and risk. "Ready for the first test?" Marcus asked, stepping back from the car. Danny nodded, his face serious with concentration. He engaged the clutch using a hand lever, selected first gear with the paddle shifter, and slowly released the clutch while applying gentle throttle pressure with his thumb control. The Formula Ford rolled forward smoothly, responding to Danny's inputs with the precision that months of careful engineering had been designed to achieve. He guided the car slowly around the garage, testing steering response, brake feel, and throttle modulation while Marcus watched every movement with critical attention. When Danny finally brought the car to a stop and shut off the engine, the silence in the garage was profound. They had done it. They had taken $12,000, 6 months of evening work, and unlimited determination, and they had created something that nobody had believed was possible. Danny looked up at Marcus and Elena, his eyes bright with emotion. "It works. It actually works." Marcus felt something unlock in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his college days, when solving impossible engineering problems had seemed like the most important thing in the world. They had built more than just a racing car. They had built proof that extraordinary things were still possible, that limitations existed primarily in assumptions rather than reality. Elena Martinez wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling, seeing her son sitting in the driver's seat of a machine that represented everything he had thought he had lost forever. The wheelchair that had become the symbol of his limitations sat empty beside the car, temporarily irrelevant to what Danny was capable of achieving. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice soft with wonder. Danny grinned, his hands still gripping the steering wheel of the car they had built together. "Now we find out how fast it goes." The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while Marcus was replacing the starter motor on a customer's pickup truck. Elena Martinez's voice sounded breathless with excitement and disbelief as she spoke rapidly into her cell phone from the hospital billing office where she worked. "Marcus, you need to get Danny out of school and come to the garage immediately," she said, her words tumbling over each other. "There are people here, important people, and they want to talk to all of us about the car." Marcus set down his wrench, wiping grease from his hands with practiced efficiency. "What kind of people?" "Racing people. Men in expensive suits driving cars that cost more than my house. They said they're from Formula One teams, and they've been waiting for Danny to arrive." Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. "Marcus, I think our lives are about to change." 30 minutes later, Marcus pulled into the parking lot of Rivera's Auto Repair to find 3 luxury sedans arranged near the entrance to his garage. The vehicles looked absurdly out of place in the industrial district, their pristine paint jobs and European styling contrasting sharply with the oil-stained concrete and weathered buildings that surrounded them. Danny sat in his wheelchair beside the Formula Ford, surrounded by 6 men in tailored suits who were examining the custom-built racing car with the intensity of surgeons studying a particularly complex procedure. Their conversation was animated but respectful, filled with technical terminology and the kind of rapid-fire questions that indicated genuine professional interest. Elena stood near the workbench, her expression oscillating between pride and overwhelm as she watched strangers evaluate months of her son's work. When she spotted Marcus approaching, relief flooded her features. "Gentlemen," she called out, "this is Marcus Rivera, the master mechanic who helped Danny build the car." The group turned as one, and Marcus found himself being studied by some of the most experienced eyes in professional motorsports. The man closest to the Formula Ford stepped forward, extending a hand with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of dollars in international careers. "Mr. Rivera, I'm James Whitfield, Chief Technical Officer for Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One team," he said, his British accent lending authority to words that seemed impossible in the context of Marcus's small garage. "We've come a very long way to see what you and Danny have created here." Marcus shook the offered hand, acutely aware of the grease still embedded under his fingernails and the contrast between his work clothes and the expensive suits surrounding him. "How did you hear about our project?" A second man stepped forward, his bearing equally professional but with the weathered look of someone who had spent decades around racing circuits. "Antonio Benedetti, Scuderia Ferrari. The video of your first test drive has been circulating through racing engineering circles for the past week. Someone posted footage online and it reached our technical departments within 48 hours. Danny looked confused. "What video?" Lena pulled out her phone, navigating to YouTube with fingers that trembled slightly from excitement. "I filmed you driving the car for the first time last week, just for our own records. I posted it on your automotive channel without thinking much about it." The video showed Danny maneuvering the Formula Ford around the parking lot behind Rivera's auto repair, demonstrating the responsiveness of the hand control system and the smooth operation of their custom-built power plant. What had seemed like a simple documentation of their project's success had somehow found its way to the highest levels of international motorsports. "The engineering solutions you've developed are remarkable," said a third man, introducing himself as Eric Johansson from the Red Bull Racing Technical Department. "We've been working on adaptive racing systems for several years, but our approaches have been far more complex and exponentially more expensive than what we're seeing here." James Whitfield walked around the Formula Ford slowly, examining the custom fabrication work with the practiced eye of someone who understood the precise tolerances and engineering principles that competitive racing demanded. "The hand control integration is brilliant in its simplicity. Most adaptive racing systems we've encountered try to replicate foot controls through mechanical linkages. Your approach eliminates unnecessary complexity by redesigning the interface entirely." Danny found his voice, still processing the surreal nature of the situation. "You're saying Formula One teams have been working on similar projects?" Antonio Benedetti nodded, his expression serious. "The FIA has been developing new regulations for adaptive racing categories. There's growing recognition that physical limitations shouldn't exclude talented drivers from competing at the highest levels of motorsports. Your car represents exactly the kind of innovation we need to make that vision reality." Eric Johansson pulled out a tablet, showing Danny technical drawings and photographs from various Formula One research and development facilities. "We've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in adaptive control systems that are less elegant and less effective than what you've built in this garage. Your solution is better engineering." The implications of their statements began to sink in as Marcus looked around his small garage, suddenly seeing it through the eyes of people who worked in state-of-the-art facilities with unlimited budgets and teams of specialized engineers. The Formula Ford that he and Danny had assembled using salvaged components and weekend labor was being evaluated as seriously as any multi-million-dollar racing development project. "What exactly are you proposing?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. James Whitfield exchanged glances with his colleagues before responding. "We'd like to offer Danny a position in our young driver development program, with full sponsorship and technical support. The adaptive control system you've developed would be integrated into our training vehicles, and Danny would have the opportunity to compete in lower Formula Series with potential advancement to Formula One if his performance warrants it." The garage fell silent, except for the distant hum of traffic and the tick of cooling metal from a recently serviced engine. Danny stared at the Formula One executives, his mind struggling to process an offer that exceeded every dream he had harbored since beginning the project. Antonio Benedetti continued. "Scuderia Ferrari is prepared to offer similar terms, along with a position in our technical development program. Your engineering insights could contribute to adaptive technologies that benefit the entire racing community." Eric Johansson nodded in agreement. Red Bull Racing would provide not just driver development but also engineering education opportunities. Your understanding of adaptive systems from a user perspective is invaluable for our research and development efforts. Marcus watched Danny's face, seeing the teenager struggle to comprehend that his impossible project had attracted attention from the most prestigious racing organizations in the world. The kid who had been told to forget about racing, to accept limitations and find quieter dreams, was being offered opportunities that most drivers could only fantasize about. "I need to think about this," Danny said finally, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly as they gripped his wheelchair's armrests. "This is all happening very fast, and these are huge decisions." James Whitfield smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he'd shown since arriving. "Of course, these are life-changing opportunities, and you should consider them carefully. We're prepared to wait for your decision. However, Antonio Benedetti added, we should mention that time is somewhat limited. The next formula development season begins in 3 months, and if Danny is interested in participating, we need to begin preparation immediately. Elena stepped closer to her son, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. What would participation actually involve? Where would Danny need to go? What kind of schedule are we talking about? Eric Johansson pulled out additional documentation, spreading contracts and program descriptions across Marcus's workbench. Training would take place at our respective facilities in Europe initially, with racing opportunities throughout the International Formula Series circuit. It's a substantial commitment, requiring relocation and full-time focus on racing development. Marcus studied the documents, noting the complexity of the legal language and the scope of the opportunities being described. These weren't casual offers or publicity stunts. The Formula One teams were proposing comprehensive driver development programs that could launch Danny into the upper echelons of international motorsports. What about the car we built? Danny asked, gesturing toward the Formula Ford they had spent months perfecting. What happens to our project? James Whitfield's expression grew more enthusiastic. That's actually one of the most exciting aspects of our proposal. We'd like to acquire the technical rights to your adaptive control system, with full credit and compensation to you and Mr. Rivera for the engineering development. The innovations you've created here could be implemented across multiple racing categories. Antonio Benedetti nodded in agreement. The automotive industry is moving toward greater accessibility in all categories of vehicles. Your control system has applications far beyond racing, in road cars, commercial vehicles, even aircraft. The licensing potential is substantial. Marcus felt his understanding of the situation shift dramatically. What had begun as a teenager's determination to return to racing had evolved into something with implications for the entire automotive industry. The solutions they had developed in his small garage could influence how vehicles were designed for millions of people with physical limitations. Gentlemen, Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of a mother protecting her child's interests. We appreciate these incredible opportunities, but we need time to discuss them as a family and understand all the implications before making any commitments. Eric Johansson smiled respectfully. Absolutely. We're staying in Phoenix for the remainder of the week, and we'd be happy to answer any questions or provide additional information as you consider the options. The Formula One executives began packing their materials, but their movements were unhurried, suggesting genuine patience rather than high-pressure sales tactics. They left business cards, contact information, and detailed program descriptions, promising to remain available for any questions or clarifications. After the luxury sedans had departed, Marcus, Danny, and Elena stood alone in the garage, surrounded by the familiar tools and equipment that suddenly seemed to belong to a different era of their lives. The Formula Ford sat unchanged, but everything around it had been transformed by possibilities they had never considered. This is insane, Danny said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. 6 months ago, we were trying to figure out how to build a car with $12,000. Now, Formula One teams are offering to pay us for our engineering work. Elena sat down on a shop stool, the weight of the moment settling over her like a blanket. These are good problems to have. But they're still problems. Moving to Europe, leaving everything we know, entering a world we don't understand. Marcus understood her concerns completely. The racing world that the executives represented was glamorous and exciting, but it was also demanding and unforgiving. Success required not just talent and determination, but also the ability to navigate complex politics, intense pressure, and constant scrutiny. What do you want to do? Marcus asked Danny directly, setting aside his own feelings about the situation to focus on what mattered most. Danny was quiet for several minutes, his gaze moving between the Formula Ford they had built together and the business cards scattered across the workbench. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same determination that had sustained them through months of seemingly impossible engineering challenges. I want to race, he said simply. Not just because it's what I used to do, but because it's what I'm supposed to do. Building this car taught me that I'm not trying to get back to who I was before the accident. I'm trying to become who I'm supposed to be now. He looked at Marcus with gratitude that went beyond words. But I also learned that the best projects happen when people work together, when different skills and perspectives combine to create something none of us could have built alone. Elena watched her son wrestle with decisions that would affect the trajectory of his entire life. seeing in his expression the same focused intensity he had brought to every aspect of their garage project. "What are you thinking, Danny?" "I'm thinking that accepting one of these offers means leaving behind the partnership that made this possible," Danny said, gesturing between Marcus and himself. "These teams want to hire me as a driver and acquire our engineering work, but they're not offering to hire the team that created the innovations they want to license." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest, a mixture of pride and loss as he recognized the direction of Danny's thoughts. The kid was right. The Formula One offers would separate them, taking Danny into a world of professional racing while leaving Marcus behind in the small garage where extraordinary things had been accomplished through ordinary means. "You can't turn down opportunities like this because of loyalty to me," Marcus said firmly. "This is your chance to compete at the highest levels of motorsports. It's everything we worked toward." Danny shook his head. "It's not loyalty. It's recognizing that the best solution isn't always the most obvious one." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found the number for Travis, his friend from the local Formula Ford racing community. "Travis, it's Danny. Remember when you asked what we planned to do after finishing the car? I think we just figured it out." The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, with Danny explaining the situation and exploring possibilities that none of them had previously considered. When he finally ended the call, his expression had shifted from uncertainty to excitement. "Travis's father has connections throughout the American racing industry," Danny explained. "He thinks there might be opportunities to develop our own racing program, something that could compete internationally while remaining based here in the United States." Elena leaned forward, intrigued by the possibility. "What kind of program?" "An adaptive racing team," Danny said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Not just me learning to drive existing cars, but a complete organization focused on developing adaptive racing technologies and providing opportunities for drivers with physical limitations." Marcus felt his understanding of the situation shift again, recognizing the scope of Danny's vision. Instead of joining existing organizations, they could create something entirely new, something that addressed the needs and possibilities that traditional racing had never fully considered. "The Formula One teams want to acquire our control system because it's better than anything they've developed," Danny continued. "But instead of selling the technology to them, we could license it while retaining ownership and continuing to develop improvements." Elena studied the business cards from the European racing teams, considering the financial security they represented against the uncertainty of starting an independent venture. "That's a much riskier path, Danny. These are guaranteed opportunities with established organizations." "Safe opportunities," Danny agreed. "But safety wasn't what motivated us to build this car. We did this because we believed something impossible could be made possible if we were willing to work hard enough and think creatively enough." Marcus walked over to the Formula Ford, running his hand along the custom fabrication work they had created together. The car represented months of problem-solving, innovation, and determination to prove that limitations existed primarily in assumptions rather than reality. "Starting our own team would mean continued partnership," he said, understanding the appeal of Danny's proposal. "We could keep developing adaptive technologies while providing opportunities for other drivers who've been told their racing dreams are impossible." "Exactly," Danny said. "And we could do it here, in this garage, with the tools and equipment that made this project successful in the first place." Elena looked around the small space where her son had rediscovered his passion and purpose, seeing it transformed in her imagination into the headquarters of something that could influence the future of motorsports accessibility. What would that actually look like? How would we fund it, organize it, make it sustainable? Danny had clearly been thinking through the practical aspects of his vision. The licensing revenue from our control system could provide initial funding. Travis's father has indicated interest in sponsorship opportunities. And there are grants available for adaptive technology development. He gestured toward the business cards from the Formula One teams. "These offers prove that our engineering work has commercial value. Instead of selling that value to existing teams, we could use it to build something new." Marcus felt excitement building in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced when they first began planning the impossible project of building a competitive racing car with limited resources. The prospect of expanding their partnership into a full racing organization represented challenges that would require everything they had learned and more. "We'd need a proper facility," he said, already beginning to plan in practical terms. More equipment, additional staff, resources for multiple vehicle development projects. And drivers, Elena added, warming to the possibilities. If this is really about creating opportunities for people with physical limitations, we'd need to identify and develop talent from communities that traditional racing has never considered. Danny nodded enthusiastically. The racing world is full of incredibly talented people who've been excluded by circumstances beyond their control. Physical limitations, financial barriers, lack of access to traditional development programs. We could address all of those obstacles. The three of them spent the remainder of the evening exploring the implications of Danny's vision, sketching plans for an adaptive racing organization that could compete internationally while remaining committed to innovation and accessibility. The more they discussed the concept, the more feasible and exciting it became. By the time Elena and Danny prepared to leave that night, they had outlined a comprehensive proposal for Rivera Racing Technologies, an organization that would develop adaptive racing systems, provide driver development opportunities, and compete in multiple racing categories with vehicles designed specifically for drivers with physical limitations. "Are you sure about this?" Elena asked her son as they prepared to leave the garage. "The Formula One offers represent security and prestige that starting our own organization can't guarantee." Danny looked back at the Formula Ford, the car that had transformed his understanding of what was possible and rekindled his sense of purpose after years of believing his dreams had been permanently derailed. "The accident taught me that security is an illusion," he said quietly. "The only thing I can really count on is what I'm willing to work for and what I'm brave enough to attempt." This feels like the right kind of brave. Marcus locked up the garage after they had left, but he found himself unable to drive home immediately. Instead, he sat in his truck in the empty parking lot, looking back at the building where extraordinary things had been accomplished through ordinary means. 25 years earlier, he had abandoned his racing dreams to save his family's auto repair business, trading possibilities for responsibilities and convincing himself that practical considerations mattered more than aspirations. Working with Danny had reminded him that the most important projects were often the ones that seemed impossible, the ones that required believing in potential rather than accepting limitations. The Formula One offers represented validation that their work had merit, but Danny's vision of an independent adaptive racing organization represented something more valuable: the opportunity to continue building something meaningful rather than simply selling what they had already created. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the garage to find Danny already waiting, a stack of printed documents and research materials balanced on his wheelchair. The teenager had clearly spent the night developing his proposal for Rivera Racing Technologies, creating detailed plans for funding, development, and competition schedules. "I called Travis's father last night," Danny said without preamble. "He's interested in meeting with us to discuss sponsorship and partnership opportunities. He also has connections with racing circuits throughout the Southwest who might be interested in adaptive racing exhibitions." Marcus unlocked the garage and helped Danny carry his materials inside, noting the thoroughness of the research and planning that had been accomplished in just one evening. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious," Danny confirmed. "I also researched adaptive racing organizations in other countries. There are successful programs in Australia and the United Kingdom, but nothing comparable in the United States. We could be pioneers in American adaptive motorsports." Elena arrived shortly after, carrying coffee for all three of them and wearing the expression of someone who had made an important decision. "I talked to my supervisor at the hospital last night," she said. "I can arrange to work part-time if we're going to start a business. The insurance settlement money could provide initial operating capital." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, recognizing that Elena's commitment represented a significant leap of faith. She was proposing to reduce her income and invest their limited savings in a venture that existed primarily in Danny's imagination and their collective determination. "The Formula One teams are expecting an answer by the end of the week," he reminded them. "If we're going to decline their offers, we need to be certain about our alternative." Danny pulled out his phone and dialed a number he had written at the top of his research notes. "Mr. Whitfield? This is Danny Martinez. I hope I'm not calling too early, but I have some questions about your offer that might help me make my decision." The conversation that followed was diplomatic but direct, with Danny explaining that he was considering multiple options, including the possibility of developing an independent racing program. James Whitfield's responses were patient and professional. suggesting genuine respect for Danny's thoughtful approach to such significant decisions. When Danny ended the call, his expression had shifted to quiet confidence. He said the offer remains open, but he also expressed interest in potential partnership opportunities if we decide to develop our own organization. Elena raised an eyebrow. Partnership opportunities? Technical collaboration, driver development support, access to racing circuits and competition opportunities, Danny explained. The Formula One teams aren't just interested in acquiring our technology. They're interested in supporting adaptive racing development because it aligns with their own research and development goals. Marcus understood the implications immediately. Instead of choosing between accepting employment with existing organizations or starting completely independently, they could potentially create hybrid arrangements that provided both autonomy and professional support. That changes the calculations significantly, he said. We could maintain control over our own program while having access to resources and opportunities that would otherwise take years to develop. They spent the morning making additional phone calls, exploring possibilities with racing circuits, potential sponsors, and technical partners. Each conversation revealed new opportunities and confirmed the viability of their emerging plan. By midday, they had outlined a comprehensive proposal for Rivera Racing Technologies that addressed funding, facility requirements, competition schedules, and driver development programs. The concept had evolved from Danny's initial vision into something that could realistically compete in national and international racing categories. "So we're really doing this?" Elena asked, looking around the garage that would soon be transformed into the headquarters of their racing organization. Danny nodded firmly. "We're doing this." Marcus felt the same excitement he had experienced during the best moments of building the Formula Ford, the sense of creating something unprecedented that could change how people thought about possibilities and limitations. "Then we better get started," he said, already planning the modifications they would need to make to accommodate multiple vehicle development projects and a proper engineering facility. 6 months later, Rivera Racing Technologies occupied a renovated warehouse facility in the same industrial district where Marcus had operated his small auto repair shop. The space housed 3 fully equipped adaptive racing vehicles, a complete engineering and fabrication workshop, and offices for the growing team of mechanics, engineers, and support staff who had joined the organization. Danny Martinez had become the lead driver and technical director, competing successfully in Formula Ford and Sports Car Club of America categories while continuing to develop improvements to their adaptive control systems. His racing results had garnered attention throughout the motorsports community, with feature articles in racing magazines and television coverage of his competition victories. Elena Martinez served as business manager, handling sponsorship relationships, financial planning, and the administrative complexity of operating a professional racing organization. Her experience with medical billing and insurance navigation had translated surprisingly well to the business aspects of motorsports. Marcus Rivera had been promoted from garage owner to chief technical officer, overseeing vehicle development projects and managing the engineering team that designed and built adaptive racing systems for customers throughout North America. The small auto repair shop continued operating as part of the larger facility, maintaining the community connections that had supported their original project. The Formula One teams had become technical partners rather than employers, providing engineering consultation, access to advanced testing facilities, and opportunities for Danny to participate in development programs during the off-season. The relationship had evolved into something more valuable than the original employment offers, collaboration between equals rather than dependency on external organizations. On a warm desert evening, Marcus stood outside the Rivera Racing Technologies facility, watching Danny complete a test session in their newest development vehicle. The sound of the high-performance engine echoed across the empty parking lot, a reminder of everything they had accomplished since that first day when a 17-year-old kid had rolled into his small garage with an impossible dream. Elena joined him in the parking lot, both of them observing as Danny guided the racing car through a series of technical maneuvers that demonstrated the precision and responsiveness of their latest adaptive control system improvements. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd taken one of the Formula One offers?" she asked, her voice carrying curiosity rather than regret. Marcus considered the question honestly, thinking about the security and prestige they had declined in favor of building something new. "I think Danny would have been successful. He has the talent and determination to compete at any level, but I don't think he would have been as happy." Danny brought the car to a stop beside them, his face flushed with exhilaration and his eyes bright with the satisfaction that came from perfect mechanical harmony between driver and machine. "How did it feel?" Marcus asked, noting the improvements in vehicle response that were evident even from watching the test session. "Like flying," Danny said, his voice filled with the same wonder that had sustained them through months of impossible engineering challenges. "But better, because we built the wings ourselves." Elena looked around the facility that had grown from their impossible project, seeing evidence of dreams that had been pursued rather than deferred, of limitations that had been challenged rather than accepted. "What's next?" she asked, understanding that their success had created new opportunities and responsibilities. Danny's grin widened as he gestured toward the workshop, where additional adaptive racing vehicles were under development. "Next, we proved that what we built here wasn't just one amazing project. We proved that extraordinary things can happen anywhere, anytime, when people refuse to accept that limitations are permanent." Marcus nodded, recognizing in Danny's words the same determination that had transformed a paralyzed teenager's impossible dream into a racing organization that was changing how the world thought about accessibility and possibility. As they prepared to lock up the facility and head home, the phone in the Rivera Racing Technologies office began ringing. Another call from someone who had been told their racing dreams were impossible, another person ready to discover what could be built when determination met opportunity, in a place where extraordinary things happened through ordinary means. Danny rolled toward the phone, already eager to hear the next impossible project that would challenge everything they thought they understood about limitations and possibilities. In the desert, where dreams had been rebuilt from scrap metal and determination, there was always room for one more miracle. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.